All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the new Student Insight session for Student Accessibility Services. My name is Nate Gondelman. I'm the Associate Director of the Office of Accessibility Services and the Director of Student Accessibility Services. I also have with me my colleague, Aaron Massey, who's an accessibility specialist, and he will introduce himself in more detail in the back half of the presentation. We have two ASL interpreters with us as well this evening, and we also have CART captioning with us as well for a real-time transcription, just kind of modeling the fact that obviously as an accessibility office, we want to foreground accessibility in our presentations. And these will be made available on demand for folks to view for recording anytime afterwards, and we'll have them captioned when they're posted as well. So just to talk a little bit about our presentation tonight, we're going to do an overview of student accessibility services. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that as an office, we've been around for several decades here at the University of Vermont, gone by different names during that period. But we're kind of entering this exciting new chapter as an office. As of the beginning of 2025, we're now part of the Office of Accessibility Services. And so for the first time, we actually have centralized accessibility at the University of Vermont. And so in addition to providing accommodations for students as we have for decades, we also provide accommodations for employees, faculty and staff, as well as members of the community, and just making the institution as a whole accessible. And I think that that centralization is due in large part based on kind of our reputation and providing robust services to students. So today, Aaron and I are going to talk about some of the differences between accessibility services in a K through 12 setting versus UVM. We'll talk about the documentation that students should submit to establish their eligibility and why we request that documentation. We'll also talk a little bit about accommodations in terms of how we make determinations around eligibility and what the purpose of accommodations are for students in a higher education setting. We'll also get into detail about student responsibilities and rights, and there is some difference from a K through 12 context to higher education. We're going to talk about faculty and how to work with them around accommodations, because that is different than kind of working with teachers in a high school setting. Talk broadly, even transcending specifically accessibility, about expectations as college students have at UVM, and provide just some advice and experience that we've had as professionals working at the university with students with disabilities, but also just in general at UVM. And then we're going to have plenty of time at the end for questions. Kind of our main goal is just to kind of give you the nuts and bolts, bread and butter of kind of what we do, how to get started with our office and what we provide, and make sure that everybody has time to ask questions that they'll want to at the end. And Aaron and I will answer them to the best of our abilities. As you can see in the chat, for anybody that wants to access that CART captioning, which I mentioned before, you can just click that stream text link, and that'll bring you to the direct transcription done by a professional CART captioner. So just kind of an overview of what we provide as an office, and this is not a comprehensive list by any means, but just kind of touching on some specifics. So we provide accommodations in classroom settings, exam settings, and for housing accommodations. Those are our most common types of accommodations, though we do provide them in clinical settings where students have placements like for student teaching or practicums. We provide accommodations in those contexts as well. But by and large, the majority of students who work with our office are specifically working with us around academic accommodations in a classroom or for their exams, and then also around accommodations related to university on-campus housing. And we'll talk about specifics around that in a little bit. We also have a team of accessibility specialists, of which Aaron is one, who work individually with students. So each student that works at our office is assigned to a student, to a specialist who will be kind of their point person, and will work with them to kind of take their narrative around what accommodations have worked, for them if they have a history of that, and also review their documentation to determine what they're eligible for. And then throughout their time at UVM, then their accessibility specialist will be their go-to person around any accommodation questions. And I think that we do a good job in the office as well of, emphasizing to students that there are other resources on campus. And we'll show some examples of this later on in the presentation that are really important for student success here at UVM that are actually separate from student accessibility services itself. We also provide accessible formatted texts for students. So a lot of students that we work with use text-to-speech software. And so if you're using any screen reading software, and we provide some of those, we actually have university licenses for some of those softwares. Whether it's a textbook or an article, we can make sure that that's in a format that is compatible with one of those text-to-speech softwares that a student's using, and we can come up with creative solutions regardless of what the context is. In addition to that, for students who are deaf or hard of hearing, we provide specific accommodations like ASL interpreting or CART services, captioning, TypeWell as well, are all examples of accommodations we can provide to students who are deaf or hard of hearing. And then we provide adaptive technology as well. So a lot of times students may require a specific type of technology depending on what the nature of their disability is and what the context, of an academic course or a program that they're involved in is. And so really what I want to emphasize here is we take an individualized approach to each student's circumstance and the course they're taking and the program they're enrolled in or whatever it might be as it relates to their experience here at UVM, and work with them to provide the appropriate accommodation based on the nature of the student's disability. So in terms of our role and responsibilities as an office, we're here to provide the services, some of which I just mentioned, to students that are set up with our office and have met with us, provided their narrative, and also submitted documentation to our office. We don't necessarily use documentation as a barrier to getting started with our office. Students can have their meeting with us first, and then we'll work with them to get documentation submitted. So I do want to emphasize that, although oftentimes documentation is going to be a key part of continuing accommodations beyond a certain point, and there are certain accommodations that a student will have to submit documentation in order to be eligible for. And really what we're trying to do as an office is make an assessment based off the documentation that's provided, as well as the student's narrative to assess a student's eligibility. And so what a student has received in the past and what is recommended by a provider that they work with, be that a physician or a psychologist, psychiatrist, counselor, therapist, whatever the appropriate provider is, we make a holistic assessment based on that meeting with the student or multiple meetings and our review of their documentation. And we don't, simply kind of take a provider's recommendation and we automatically provide that. That carries certainly a lot of weight with us, but we're really trying to make an assessment based on that meeting with the student and the documentation they provide to, verify students' disability and the functional limitations that may result from that, and be able to pinpoint what accessibility barriers may show up as a result of that, and then provide the appropriate accommodation on that basis. And so that's the key part for us, is making sure that it's an accommodation based on a disability, as opposed to specifically something that's a convenience or a study aid. And so that's something that we're making assessment on frequently as we work with students. And we can talk, there are multiple study aids and different things like that that are outside of our office that we can connect students for that just aren't provided in the context specifically of an accommodation. And then there's an interactive process as well. And so there's something that I always want to kind of emphasize, we're talking with students and families, is our goal with any type of accommodation is to make sure it's something the student is eligible for, but depending on the context that it's provided in, we have to make sure that it doesn't pose a fundamental alteration to a course. That is a relatively rare circumstance, and it depends on the accommodation, how frequently that might come up. There's so much variability kind of involved in these determinations. But that is an interactive process that involves the student, the faculty member, or the staff member, if it's a specific program the student's involved in, as well as our office. And, in the event that there is a concern on a fundamental alteration, that's a conversation that we have together as a group. And certainly if it, in a situation of a student and a faculty member, there's a hierarchy involved there. And so one of the roles of our office, beyond just kind of making these determinations around eligibility, is to make sure that, the student has a fair arbiter in kind of our office to help facilitate those conversations around the interactive process. And in the rare circumstances where there might be a valid concern around a fundamental alteration, we're working with the student and the faculty to explore viable alternatives that will still reasonably address a disability-related barrier for a student. Talked a little bit about the transition that's involved from K through 12 setting to a university higher ed setting. And so just a couple examples of that. As I mentioned before, we take an individualized approach to all specific, student cases. We have a lot of students who may have the same exact diagnoses or disabilities, and they might receive different accommodations depending on kind of what their history is and how that disability shows up for them. And so it's not, a situation where students with a specific type of disability automatically get these accommodations or don't get these accommodations. We're making those individualized assessments. And there are different laws that govern accessibility in a K through 12 context versus higher ed. And so really the key piece that I want to emphasize is the role of student advocacy. So in a K through 12 setting, students may have experience with being self-advocates, but it's really important, even whether or not students are coming in with that experience or not, to understand that as a student, you kind of have to take the initiative to get set up with our office. And we can talk about this more in detail if folks may have questions about this, but really encouraging students, if you're attending this meeting or watching it and haven't gotten started with our office yet, encourage you to do so. But if there's something that's going on as it relates to your accommodations, or there's a change as it relates to your disability, you're going to want to be in touch with us and let us know, because it's much less likely than in a high school context that we're going to have an idea that that's happening if you're not telling us. Occasionally, faculty will reach out to us, but that's not something that I would ever suggest to a student that they count on. And so it's really important to be able to take that initiative, and that's part of the reason we have an assigned specialist, is we want there to be a person the student feels comfortable with that they can reach out to let us know if there's something going on. And then we can get involved and address it to the best of our abilities. And in terms of documentation requirements, I mentioned that a student doesn't have to submit documentation in order to have an introductory meeting with our office. And there are some accommodations, certain accommodations that we can provide on a provisional basis for a certain period of time for students. But ultimately, in order to keep those accommodations going in the long run, past an academic year, or to be eligible for certain other accommodations that do require documentation, it's really key that students provide that to us. And so, examples of documentation that students can submit: have a 504 plan or an IEP from high school that can be submitted. That's not required in any way, but it's always helpful to have an understanding of kind of what was provided if the student has a history of accommodations. Additionally, if a student has an evaluation, a neuropsych or educational assessment, that can be provided as well. But we also have forms on our website. So we have come up with forms that can be filled out. For example, if a student is working with a therapist or a psychiatrist or a physician or any provider that's relevant to their disability, that can be completed as well to give us a sense of the student's diagnosis, what functional limitations might result of that, how that shows up in an academic context or just any context at the university, and what accommodations are recommended or appropriate. And once a student submits that documentation and gets established for eligibility, unless they are requesting other accommodations, generally more documentation is not required. There might be certain situations where we'll ask a student to provide follow-up information, but those are relatively rare. For the most part, once a student gets that eligibility established through the narrative meeting process and providing documentation, and they establish kind of their eligibility for their initial set of accommodations, that's something they can continue semester to semester throughout their time at UVM, and without having to submit new information on a regular basis. And at this point, as we transition to accommodations, I'm going to toss it over to my colleague, Aaron Massey, to introduce himself and take it from there.
Oh, hello, everybody. Thank you so much, Nate. My name is Aaron Massey. I'm an accessibility specialist here at Student Accessibility Services. I am actually also a UVM alumnus. I graduated back in 1996. And I've been on a long journey that brought me eventually back to UVM. I spent 18 years in a special education, alternative education environment, and just did a lot of work with students with disabilities and their families. And that experience led me back to UVM, and I found myself about 3.5 years ago connecting with student accessibility services and applied for the position and was uh, thankfully accepted into the role. And I've been doing it ever since and absolutely love doing this. I love to be able to serve the students and the families and work with my campus partners and things like that. So I'm very excited to be here with you tonight. I will attempt to not be super wordy so that we leave enough time for y'all to ask questions and stuff. But let me jump into accommodations. Ultimately, accommodations at the college level, as Nate said, there can be some differences between what's available to students in the K through 12 environment versus the college environment. And ultimately, what we're looking at is equitable access to the college experience for students. And it's really important that those accommodations don't create any kind of an advantage. And in fact, we do some advocacy with folks to talk about how accommodations aren't an advantage. They're specifically designed not to be that. They're really designed to give students the ability to engage in their college education in a way that works with their disability. And so we want to provide those accommodations so that students that have a deficit in a certain area or a barrier to accessing things can move beyond that so that they can take this journey at UVM with us. So um, things that Nate sort of talked about that I'll sort of reiterate around accommodations. Everything is individualized. We do have this sort of lengthy list of accommodations, but they're not a one size fit all. It's not, I have ADHD, therefore I get these accommodations. It really comes down to the individual's lived experience, what the information that they share through their student narrative and through that documentation. And so we'll look at everything on that individualized basis and make determinations from there. And a lot of times, the experience that students had at the K through 12 level or at a previous university can inform that. But sometimes, there are some differences. And so we work with students to try to figure out what those differences are. Some accommodations are exactly the same. Extended time on tests and quizzes is a great example. Super common at the high school level, super common at the college level. And often those just sort of are almost like a one-to-one, accommodation transfer, but ultimately, really taking the time to consider the individual's experience. The other thing is that we really want to make sure that students have this opportunity to learn. One of the big differences when I talk with students about accommodations is that in the K through 12 world, they're really looking through the lens of success. So when I worked in that special ed environment, we were designing the things that we did to accommodate students in a way that allowed them to do the math, write the papers, engage at in the workplace, whatever that might be, but ultimately designed to get them to graduation. And I think that, a big lens change for college level accommodations is this idea that instead of looking through the lens of success, we're looking through the lens of access. So no guarantee that you'll get to the end of the road, but we're going to do everything we can to create the opportunity for you to get there. And so this is where I think Nate was talking about self-advocacy and really taking initiative. It's really important that students understand that. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that a little later on. And getting back to the piece about fundamental alteration, we have to be really careful to make sure that our accommodations aren't an advantage. And one of the ways that we do that is to determine whether or not an accommodation might fundamentally alter sort of the essential elements of a course or the standards. And that's one thing at the college level that we're not able to do. If you're going to be a chemist, there's certain things you need to learn along the way in order to do that job. And so we can't change that part. How you learn those things, we might be able to make some adjustments, using an audio book to, get through those dense chemistry chapters isn't changing the fact that you still need to learn all the information that's in there. So that would be an example. Another thing that's really important, and this I think comes down to I use the term early and often. So it's really, really important for students, especially ones that are coming to the university for the first time, or maybe in a college setting for the first time, to really reach out and ask for help as early as possible, and specifically when it comes to accommodations, because accommodations cannot be used retroactively. So, if you had extended time in high school and you're like, I'm going to see how college goes, and that first exam comes and it doesn't go as well as you had hoped, and you're like, oh man, I really did need that extended time. We can't go back and apply that extended time to that exam that's already passed. We can apply it to exams coming up, but that's just an important key distinction. And then I think the other thing that's just important is that, a lot of students come in and they're like, oh, I have my 504, I have my IP, and I need to transfer that to UVM. Because the law is different and because the accommodation process is different, it's not necessarily a direct transfer. We do utilize those documents to help give us the context for what the student has experienced. But some accommodations that are available to students at the K through 12 level just aren't available, or are very different at the college level. And so we part of our process is to sort of explain that so that students aren't going in with sort of false sense of expectations. So let's talk a little bit about student rights under the Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 504 of the 1973 Rehabilitation Act. So ultimately, the laws were written and the laws have been sort of analyzed, and there has been all this precedent set in courts regarding all these things. So a lot of the language that we use comes from that. And one of the things that we use often is this concept of reasonable and appropriate accommodations. And so we want to make sure when a student needs extended time on a testing quiz, that's a really common accommodation that doesn't generally bump up against fundamental alteration. How much time it takes you to complete a pop quiz or an exam, that's not going to change the nature. You still need to know the material. You still need to be able to produce the answers that the professor is looking for that demonstrate your knowledge. But we want to make sure that we're going through the interactive process, supporting the students all the way, working with faculty, working with staff, and different programs to make sure that those accommodations sort of meet that standard of reasonable and appropriate. Again, the accommodations can find their way to lots of different settings. So classrooms are one of the most common, that along with the testing environment. But some students will need accommodations to access campus activities or different programs. The housing accommodations is another big one, making sure that people have a living environment that works and that meets their individual needs. We also support students in internships and clinical rotations. And we actually have an accessibility specialist that whose primary focus is working with folks in the College of Nursing, Larner College of Medicine, and the health sciences, because sometimes those settings, the accommodations need to be adjusted, or we need to really work hard with those parts of the university to make sure that the accommodations are reasonable and appropriate and aren't a fundamental alteration, because the standards in those programs can be sometimes significantly higher. I think the other thing that is really important, and I say this regularly to my students, everything that students provide to us, whether it's via their narrative, their documentation, letters of support from providers, that information is confidential and private. And we do not share that unless we are working with a student and we need to share that, and they're a part of that conversation. So sometimes we'll connect them with their college student services office, and we need to share some information so that those folks know what kind of support to bring to the conversation. But we're not going to do that without the student, making sure that they have permission. And so that also means that we can't communicate with parents and providers without explicit permission from the students. So we have a form that students fill out to get started with our office. And on that form, they're able to supply us with information about who do they feel comfortable with us sharing information about their case. And they can change that that confidentiality, that consent at any time. They can take people off, they can add people on. And sometimes this comes up, I think, with students that are maybe new to their diagnoses, new to their disability. They just recently got a diagnosis and they're still trying to figure out what that means for them. And so sometimes they want us to talk with their provider so that we can get more information, get more context about what's going on. And obviously, if it's their therapist and they've been talking about some stuff that's, really difficult, we want to make sure that it's okay for us to go there before we do that. So the information is protected by the FERPA law. And so that's just a really important thing. So in terms of student responsibilities, I think, the first and foremost is getting connected to our office. A lot of times, not a lot of times, but sometimes we hear from students and they're like, hey, I submitted my documentation or I submitted my getting started form. How come I don't have my accommodations? And that's because one of the key elements to providing accommodations at the college level, and particularly at UVM, is this meeting with the accessibility specialist. So that narrative portion of the process where we're hearing from the student about their experience, about their needs, and then working from there, that's super important. So students have to complete our getting started form that sort of registers you with our office and sets up a file in our system, but there needs to be the follow-up meeting. And so that the student has the responsibility to schedule that meeting. We will send out an email. Our office, as soon as they get the getting started form, sends out an automated email saying, like, here's your assigned specialist. This is how you set up an appointment. But it's really important for students to follow through with that and make that appointment and then come and meet with their specialist. Similarly, it's cannot emphasize the importance of doing things as soon as possible. So we have, a summer, all summer that we meet with students. We work year round, and getting things set up ahead of time is so important because that first few weeks of school orientation, that is just there's a lot of information coming. It's coming really fast. For a lot of students, it's a really big transition to come to college and be more independent and doing their own laundry and getting their own food and all of the things that are required. And so having to set up your accommodations while you're doing all that can be really challenging. So we really recommend that students reach out early, get your accommodations set up, so that you sort of one less thing to deal with. And I think also just in terms of like some of the systems that we have set up for students around things like peer note takers and exam accommodations, there are additional sort of steps for those processes. And it's important that students learn how to access those supports and then make sure that they are engaging in those things early so they don't get halfway through the semester and be like, oh no, I didn't set up my peer note taker, so I haven't had notes for the last several weeks. Other things I think that it's really important and really incumbent upon students is to make sure that they understand their responsibility around notifying their faculty. So with our system, students will go into our My Access student portal and send their accommodation letters for the accommodations that they're requesting in their individual classes. And so that is a really important responsibility. You may be eligible for X, Y, and Z accommodations, but if you haven't sent your letters of accommodation, then you sort of like haven't officially activated your accommodations for a given semester. Now, students can do that at any time, and sometimes students will wait until they know an exam's coming up, and then they'll send their letter and set up their exam accommodations. But again, we recommend doing that at the beginning of the semester, making sure that you're following up with professors to let them know what accommodations you're seeking and what your needs are. So this piece about interacting with professors is so important. We interact with faculty regularly to help them understand how accommodations might be applied in their class, but it's also really important for students to develop those relationships. College can be really different than high school environment, especially for students that are coming from smaller schools where there's maybe less students. They have more time and interaction with their teachers. That can be really different. You get into a class with 100, 200, 300 students, there might not be that same level of individual connection with that professor. So for students that work with our office, making those connections early, building that positive rapport and that relationship with the faculty, so that if you have questions, if their challenges come up, you've already developed that relationship, and so you're not trying to develop a relationship while trying to manage a problem. I think it's really, really important, and that gets back to what Nate was saying about self advocacy. You know, UVM, most of the programs, most of the offices on campus are student driven. Folks are here to help and they're here to serve, but they have to know that you need that help and that you need that service. And so it's really, really important for students to step up. Accessibility specialists, I think we do a great job of being a support, but ultimately the responsibility lies with the student. Similarly, professors have a role, and this role can be really different, I think, than what folks might have experienced with their teachers in high school. Some of the primary differences: the professor is going to provide the material. They're going to provide the information that the student needs to learn in order to get through the class, to be successful, to earn the grades they're looking for. And the students are responsible for the learning part of that. So one thing it's important to know is that professors are experts in their field. They may not be teachers. They may not have an education as a teacher. So they really know their area, and they can provide you with all of that knowledge and their experience, but they may not necessarily have classroom experience as an actual teacher. Making sure that they're making the classroom, accessible and all those kinds of things. So that advocacy piece, sending the letters of accommodation, working with our office so that we can support the students, that becomes just that much more important. Not all professors are going to understand disability. Not all of them are going to understand accommodations. Some of them are going to have, negative perspectives and see accommodations in the way that they're not intended. And we, again, do a really good job of trying to break down those barriers and destigmatize both disability and accommodations. But it's important for students to know going in that your professors don't necessarily know what extended time means. They don't necessarily know what flexible attendance means. And so we do a good job of trying to explain that to them. But we don't want students to go in thinking like, oh, I sent my letters, and so my professor will automatically know everything that I need. The other thing I think that is important is, and this is, I think, part of what we call the hidden curriculum, which is like things that students may not know about the college experience. And one of those is office hours. So professors and sometimes their teaching assistants will set up times during the week to be available to students outside of class. Those are called office hours. And they can do an individual one-on work in that time, but it's a relatively limited time frame, and it's not going to be the same as like staying after school and meeting with your teacher to work on your project. And so because of that limitation, they're not necessarily going to be the best resource for tutoring and academic support. We have other services on campus that Nate talked about, and we'll talk about more in a little bit, that are there for students to support them in that way when the teacher is not as available, maybe as the student needs them to be. And then, another really key thing is that professors have a lot of leeway in terms of how they design their courses and how they present the information. And so there can be a really wide variety of classroom styles, of teaching styles. There can be, sort of just long lectures where the teacher is just going to present the information and the students are going to absorb it. And then there are other classrooms that are going to be more dynamic. We have some classrooms that are called flipped classrooms, where students will do a lot of their learning outside of the classroom and then bring that learning to class to do some more sort of dynamic, interactive work with the material. So there can be a lot of variables and a lot of variation, and that's another important factor for students to know. So in terms of classroom etiquette and expectations, students coming to UVM are generally adults. Sometimes there are folks that aren't quite adult yet, but are coming into this more of an adult environment. So if you need to leave class and go get a drink, go to the bathroom, generally that's fine. Professors are gonna they'll let you know if there's a time when that's not appropriate, but generally you can do that. You don't need to ask permission. You don't need a hall pass. But what is important is that students understand the expectations of the classroom, because it can be different with different instructors. And so the course syllabus is really the key to unlocking those expectations and understanding them. The course syllabus is going to describe sort of everything the student needs to know about that class, when the class meets, who the professor is, their preferred mode of communication, when the exams are, when your projects are due, and what the attendance and grading policies for the class are. So that's where you would find information about, are there going to be natural breaks built into the class? Do students just take breaks as they need to? That information should be provided in the course syllabus. Um, the other thing that the professors are going to do is that they're going to provide the design of the course and the course requirements. So they're gonna let you know about, is attendance mandatory? Are there excused absences available? What are the participation policies? Is this the kind of class where we're gonna throw a bunch of information at you and you're just gonna absorb it on your own and present it via paper or via an exam? Or are there going to be group discussions or projects that are where the teams are set up? So there can be a lot of variation there. And so again, really important to check the course syllabus. Similarly with grading, just because you work hard doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get the grades that you're used to. Performance is typically the way that professors grade. How'd you do on that exam? How did you do on that paper? How did you do on your homework? And they'll give you a very clear description of how they're grading, how much each part of the class is weighted in terms of that grade. But working hard isn't the sole factor. Sometimes I think students are like, but I did so much. I studied so hard, all this kind of stuff, and I'm still struggling. And that can be because the teacher has a generalized expectation about what you need to be able to show in terms of your performance. So that's another really important thing I think is important to know. And then again, professors may initiate contact, and then again, they may not. So for students that have accommodations, really important that you reach out and make that connection. If you're not understanding material, really important that you talk with your professor about that and let them know. If there are teaching assistants available, utilizing them as a resource. And then using us, your accessibility specialists, as a way to connect and understand what other resources are available out there. And we'll, again, talk a little bit more about that in a bit. So in terms of interacting with professors, once you send your letter of accommodation at the beginning of the semester or whenever you send it, you always are going to want to follow up. You can follow up with an email, that's fine. Some professors are not great about responding to emails in a timely way. So it's really incumbent upon the student to make sure that they're making that connection. Talk to the professor before or after class. Hey, did you get my letter of accommodation? Can we set up a time to discuss my accommodation needs, make sure that they understand how they're going to work in your class? That's really, really, really important. It's important to have a plan so that you can set yourself up to have a positive experience in that class. I think that the other thing that's really important is that professors that are engaged by their students, I think they really appreciate that. They don't know. They don't know what your experience is. They don't know what your needs are. So when you come to them and say, hey, I really struggle with this, and I have this accommodation that helps support me with that, they're going to really appreciate that. And from the faculty that I work with that are engaging with students at that level, that is so much better than when they just sort of get a letter out of the blue and nobody ever talks to them. Because then that's also where I think not misinformation, but miscommunication can happen. You sent the letter, so you just sort of assume things are going to be okay, and then the professor makes assumptions and then finds out that you're both making sort of false assumptions. So in order to avoid that, better to make that connection and interact with that professor. So a few things to just help move you towards success. Again, success isn't guaranteed. Accommodations aren't going to guarantee that you're getting an A in that class, but there are some things that you can do to improve your chances of achieving your goals. Managing your time is probably the biggest one. You are going to be away from home. Your parents aren't going to be there. You need to do your laundry, clean your room, take care of yourself, exercise, eat, all of these things you're going to be responsible for. And you also need to be a full-time student. So managing your sleep cycle, knowing when you're going to get your exercise in, knowing when you're going to study and what you need to be successful when studying. All of those things are super important. And it's really important that you schedule time throughout your day. You might have a really like great schedule where you've got, 3 classes in the morning and the rest of the afternoon off. It's not really off because that's when you got to do your homework and that's when you have to prep for your next class or study for your upcoming exam. So managing your time is really, really important. And for students that struggle with that, struggle with executive function and time management, there are supports, both accommodation supports, but also additional supports through things like the UVM Tutoring Center, their study skills program that can help students learn those skills and bolster any deficits they might have in those areas. I think it's also really important to track your own progress. Pay attention to your grades, know what your grades are. Again, some professors are great about being timely in their, getting the grades back on an exam or on a paper. Some are not. So it's really important for the student to be there to advocate for their themselves and make sure that they're saying, hey, like, I noticed you didn't post that grade. What is my grade on that exam? So I know what adjustments I need to make. And one thing that is sort of part of that hidden curriculum is academic alerts. So for students that maybe are struggling in a class, maybe they haven't been coming to class, they're not turning in their homework, they missed an exam. Some professors will provide an academic alert. They'll sort of say, hey, I noticed you haven't been in class this week, or hey, I noticed you didn't do particularly well on that first exam. Let's have a conversation. Sometimes they won't do that, and so that's where it's really important that students sort of manage that and make sure that they're understanding where they're at in the class. Attendance is really a key part of the college experience. Some classes have mandatory attendance, where other ones don't. But being in the class, being present, being engaged is super important. If you're not going to class, sure, you can learn the stuff in the book and the slides that maybe are posted online, but you're going to miss all of the interaction that's happening in the classroom, interaction with your peers and things like that. And that's just an important part of the college experience. Again, I already talked about the syllabus. That is your guide. That is your outline for what to expect in that class and what you need to do in order to be successful in that class. And then I think the other thing is that, and I'll speak from my own experience, I was a really good student in high school. And then I got to college and I thought I had great study habits. Turns out not so much. So I had to learn some new ones. And I think it's just important to make sure that you're constantly growing your toolkit, making sure that you do have effective strategies, and if you don't, that you seek help to try to learn some new strategies. And again, the study skills program at the tutoring center is a great resource for that, because it's just, you're here, you're investing in your future. So learning the material, retaining the material so that you can use it, down the road in your future is really, really important. Just a few things to think about. Especially in that first semester of college where that transition can be pretty jarring, consider taking a lighter course load. There's a range for full-time status students between 12 and 18 credits. There's a really big difference between 12 credits and 18 credits. So knowing yourself, knowing what the workload that you feel that you can handle, and using that range of credits is really important. We have an accommodation that some students are eligible for called a reduced course load that allows students to retain their full-time status but take less than full-time status credits, 6 to 11 credits. So for students who really need to slow down, maybe need to focus a little bit more on their mental health or just need more time to process and do the work, reduced course load might be appropriate. But it's just important not to try to overdo it, not to spread yourself too thin, because it's the long haul. You're again really an investment in that there's a lot that's going to happen over that 4 years, so you don't want to burn yourself out too soon. Classroom sizes can be really variable and can be really variable from your previous experience. So there can be some really large classrooms with just a lot of students and very little individual interaction with those professors. And some of those courses you may just have to take because that's the introductory level chemistry course that's available that all students need to take, that are required to take chemistry. But then utilizing the resources outside of the classroom to really get the support that you need, whether it's tutoring, supplemental instruction, the study skills. There are a lot of resources, so just don't hesitate to ask for help and seek those resources. And then, a really good advice is to really emphasize doing as well as you can that first semester, really starting off strong academically, really working to start off with a really solid GPA so that you're like, okay, this is where I'm at and I want to continue to grow and develop. And again, from my own experience, if you don't have a strong GPA your first semester, it's okay. You can learn the skills you need to learn and you can get better. My first semester didn't go as well as I had hoped, but I ended up doing fine down the end. So last thing I want to just say about our particular approach at Student Accessibility Services, and one of the main reasons that I love working for this office and supporting students in the way that we do, is this holistic approach that we take. We do not see students just as students with disabilities or students with ADHD or students with depression. We see them as whole people, and we really want to make sure that they are well, that they have access to the things that they need in order to remain well. And so being able to connect with our campus partners around wellness, academic supports, faith-based supports, identity, all of those resources are available to all of our students, and we really want to make sure that they have access to it. So we do a lot of referrals, and we work with all of these campus partners to make sure that students have the things that they need in order to feel good and to be able to continue on their journey at UVM and hopefully achieve the success and the goals that they set for themselves. So this is really, really a vital part of what we do and how we see our interaction with students and families. So that was a lot of words, even though I said I was going to try to do less words. But we really want to open things up at this point to give you all an opportunity to ask questions. And we'll do our best to answer as many of those as we can.
Thanks so much, Aaron. I know we already have a couple in the Q&A, and there's at least one in the chat, which we'll address. But please, if send them in if folks have questions. And Aaron and I have our individual contacts up there as well, and kind of have our general email account. So if there's anything folks want to ask confidentially or related to a specific circumstance they're navigating, you're certainly welcome to do that directly as well. But we know a lot of questions that folks might have could be useful for others too. And one thing I'll also mention before we get into the questions is that it's important to recognize we work with about 22% of the student population here. When I started working here, which was 20 years ago as an undergraduate, we worked with 500 to 600 students, and now we're working with just under 3,000. And so that's always a good thing for students to know, is that, in a class, generally 1 out of every 4 or 5 of your peers is also going to be using accommodations. And so it's very commonplace at UVM. I think we take pride in that. We offer robust services, and that students with disabilities feel comfortable going here and feel like that they're going to get the accessibility provided to them by our office. And because of that, faculty are also familiar with the processes as well, because they are used to working with students that have different types of accommodation requests in their classes. So we'll start going through some questions. And I know that one of some of the questions I addressed that were kind of straightforward, I provided a link in the Q&A to kind of the forms page of our website, where we have different forms to the students can submit to our office to kind of establish their eligibility. So please find that link there. This kind of a centralized one-stop shop for all of that. There's also a question here about deadline for documentation, and do we accommodate officially undiagnosed disabilities, or do we need an official diagnosis? So there's no deadline. Students can get started with our office at any time. We work with students who are in their second semester of their senior year. We're not going to turn them away, but I would say that it is crucial to a student's success to get started with us as early as possible. Students have the flexibility to decide whether or not they're going to use their accommodations in a particular course or from semester to semester, but cannot emphasize how much easier it is to have things set up and have them in place, and then decide not to use them, or decide to use them kind of, in a particular class, as opposed to waiting and saying, I don't think I need this, and then kind of getting started with our office from scratch. Because Aaron and I outlined the process from kind of meeting to submitting documentation and review. That's not something that can happen in a couple of days. That's generally a few weeks at least. And kind of at the beginning of, say, the fall semester, it might be a little bit longer. So I really encourage students, if you haven't got started with our office now, there's still plenty of time for you to start that process now and have things in place for the start of the semester. But once we start getting into August, then it gets a little bit closer to being unsure if we can get set up in time for the start of the semester. So I would say definitely have it as a goal to get, if you haven't started with us yet, to have your documentation into us, by the end of July, and get that meeting set up with us. There's no need to wait for that. We have the getting started form on our website, and you can get that meeting started now. And even if you don't have documentation submitted, that might help you determine what you need to submit. There is, as it relates to a deadline, the one thing I will mention is June 1st was the deadline for housing accommodation requests. So if you haven't submitted a request related to a housing accommodation, so that would be, you need a specific type of room based on a disability, you can still submit that. The reason we have that deadline is just because it gives us the best chance of making sure for eligible students something is in place before the start of the semester. You can still submit that to our office, and we'll interact with that request and work as best we can to kind of assess eligibility, and if a student's eligible, get that in place. So definitely, if there's any folks here who haven't put in a housing request in or planning on doing that, I would prioritize that, because that is a more time sensitive turnaround than academic requests, which we still have a couple of months before those are in place. And then as it relates to the question around a diagnosis or not, generally students who work with our office do have an official diagnosis. However, if a student is working with the provider and it's unclear about what their diagnosis is, but they do have an established relationship with a provider and they can speak to kind of specific limitations that are showing up, and they're kind of working with the student around a specific diagnosis and just aren't clear on that yet, we'll certainly do our best to work with that. And we're not going to turn a student away, even if there isn't a formal diagnosis settled upon. The key thing there would just be making sure that there is a relationship with the provider and they can speak to kind of how that's manifesting itself and how that might show up in an academic context, to give us the best sense of what accommodations that we would need to provide. There is a question here in the chat around next steps to set up a meeting for accommodation determinations. That would be filling our getting started form that's on our website. I can put the link to that as well in the chat here. And now, Aaron, there's a question here that would be a good one, I think, for you to tackle, about any accountability groups or support groups for students with ADHD.
Yeah. So a couple of things that currently exist, and then some sort of hope for the future. So right now, there are a lot of resources available to support students, to provide them with sort of some external accountability, some external structure. As I mentioned earlier, the Tutoring Center is one of those key supports. There's 3 distinct programs at the Tutoring Center: subject area tutor. So if students are struggling with the content of the course, they can request a subject area tutor. The study skills program, which is really more about developing those executive function skills and learning the study habits that you need at the college level, how to study for exams, how to take notes in an effective way. And then supplemental instruction, which is for courses that are historically really challenging, high level of withdrawals and D's and F's. They have these supplemental instruction, these peer-led study groups where students should just get additional time with the material with a peer that really understands the expectations of the class and can support students in that other way. The UVM Writing Center is another amazing resource. It's open to all students. You can get up to like an hour a day, I think, with them. So it can become a part of the structure of a student's day to really help. And then you have somebody that you're meeting with that you can be accountable to. On the sort of more future side of things, a couple of really cool things that are sort of in the works. We just recently had a graduate student that was working on their capstone project, specifically about supporting students with ADHD and autism through the lens of occupational therapy. And so we have a new occupational therapy office on campus, not far from our office. And we're hoping to begin to engage more with them in terms of that resource being available to students. And I've just recently accepted a role on our new ADHD task force. And we're going to really be looking at what services are currently available to students with ADHD, and then what supports do we really need to bolster, things like academic coaching, having a professional academic coaches on staff, things like that. So that's all stuff that is hopefully coming along. But there are a lot of supports It's just important for students to check in with their specialist and figure out what those supports are that they may need.
Thanks, Aaron. Yeah, we're very excited about that task force and what possibilities that might include, as well as a future collaboration with occupational therapy. Going on to some other questions that are in the chat. We talked about, both Aaron and I mentioned kind of this concept of a fundamental alteration, and there's a good question here about what counts as a fundamental alteration to a course. I shared a link in reply to that kind of talks about the process that we might move through with a faculty member or a staff member, depending on the context around that question. And there's no kind of one answer as to what constitutes a fundamental alteration, because each course is different, and similar to kind of the individualized approach that we talked about as we take with students, this comes up in terms of a fundamental alteration as well. It's really about kind of what the expectations of the specific course or program are, and whether or not a specific type of accommodation really compromises that. And again, this is not a common occurrence, but it does come up, and it might be more likely with some accommodations than others. For example, it would be really rare with extended time, but an easy example would be if a student is taking a CPR course or kind of wilderness survival, extended time would, for obvious reasons, be problematic potentially in that if a student is taking, a CPR course and having to kind of demonstrate their ability to provide CPR. And so that's a really easy example. That's not the situation it might normally show up for. But there are situations where, students who might have a specific type of flexibility with attendance or assignment extensions or things like that. In one course, they might be able to miss more classes than in another course, because one course is more lecture based, and students are able to kind of get that information and make up the material in one way, versus another course that's more interactive and based on discussion. Because of the participation grade, only a very limited amount of attendance flexibility can be provided in that course. So it's really kind of a moving target depending on the nature of the course and the accommodation. But again, that's all part of the interactive process that we go through each and every time. And so that's something that we take very seriously and invest a ton of time into if and when that circumstance does come up. And it's something that the student is engaged in throughout the process, and takes place again between our office faculty member and the student. There's also another question here about how urgent it is for students to schedule a meeting with SAS. They only need one minor accommodation. I wouldn't say it's urgent, but kind of going back to what I was saying before, if a student establishes their eligibility now and kind of has that meeting, provides documentation, then that's something that's generally, in most cases, and with very few exceptions, going to be in place for them throughout their time at UVM. And so, Aaron talked about sending letters at the beginning of a semester. Students can send their accommodation letters, for example, if they have extended time, or say note-taking accommodation, which are two most common types of accommodations. And then they don't have to schedule an exam at our exam proctoring center. They can take the exam in class without the extended time or the reduced distraction environment if they so choose. And so I really want to emphasize that it's not a matter of kind of, urgent to necessarily get it set up for the sake of having the accommodation in place for that specific course, but just because of the unpredictability of students transitioning to a higher education environment, I really would always encourage folks to get things set up. And then, if they decide that it's something they don't want to use in a particular class, or even for the whole semester or for the whole year, totally a student's right. And we absolutely respect that. And sometimes it's just that one course or that one, situation where a student wants that accommodation, but it's better for them to have that in place, because sometimes we have students that do come to us a week before an exam, and they're in their second semester, sophomore year. And generally at that point, we're not going to be able to get that set up in time for that exam. And so there's just really no downside to kind of getting it set up, here in the summer. And then it's just one less thing for the student to have to worry about if and when that situation might arise. An accommodation here, any accommodations for note taking, somebody taking notes, but more like the teacher provides notes for the class. So that's a combination of different, types of circumstances. So broadly speaking, peer note taking, which after extended time is our second most common type of exam accommodations, is a student in the class and they're not aware of who they're taking notes for. Oftentimes it's multiple students and the student actually isn't aware who the note taker is. We'll upload notes to our My Access portal and a student can access those notes online. They get an email notification each time notes are uploaded. That's generally how that accommodation works. However, there are faculty who just do this as part of their course. And so either they themselves will provide notes or they'll assign a TA. And they may work with us to provide those notes through the My Access portal for students that have that accommodation. But there is a universal design approach sometimes that certain faculty members will take, or they provide it to all students, in which case that's great. And then the accommodation might be unnecessary in that circumstance just because of the universal design of the course. But that is an accommodation that we do provide, and definitely one of our more common types of accommodations. Aaron, I'll throw this one to you. We have a question about what are some spaces or accommodations possibly specific to students with autism or ADHD in classroom or housing communities? Oh, you're on mute, Aaron.
Classic Massey forgetting to unmute himself before he talks. Yeah, so again, accommodations are not necessarily diagnostically specific. So I think it's really important for students with autism, students with autism, ADHD combination, the meeting with that specialist to really fully understand your context and what are your strengths, what are your areas of challenge, what accommodations you need. Like that is the beginning of that, of understanding that, because everybody needs something different, right? Something that works for my ADHD may not work for yours. And so I think in terms of like spaces, there are a lot of quiet spaces. There are a lot of study spaces on campus. I've had students who are like, oh, I go to the library, I spend hours there, I get everything done. And I have other students who are like, I can't stand the library. There's too many distractions. People are constantly going by. So I think in terms of like, where are those spaces? I think does require some exploration, but we have a list of sort of potential quiet spaces across campus that we share with students, and then sometimes students sort of have to kind of find those spaces for themselves. There are some quiet booths around campus in the library. I think there's one at the Career Center where students can go in and kind of like sequester themselves and sort of shut out some of the external stimuli. In terms of like accommodations specifically, a lot of times housing accommodations come into play for folks on the spectrum or folks, that have conditions where like they may have real sensory challenges. So, maybe they need to have, one less roommate. Maybe they need to have no roommates. So I think there are a lot of different things, but I would just sort of follow the guidelines that we're sort of talking about tonight, which is just come to our office, come talk with us, let us know what needs you have, and then we will work with you to try to figure out what's best for you. I think the area, the autism like ADHD, there's areas where there's so much information that a lot of folks don't have access to. And so it can be really a challenging environment for some folks until they learn how to advocate for themselves, get their needs met through accommodations, and then we do some advocacy and some education to try to help professors understand what some of those differing needs might be for folks with various disabilities. So so those are some examples. Just knowing that we have a relatively limited time, I am absolutely happy to schedule time with folks via email, set up a Teams meeting to talk about your sort of individual situations. Sometimes that can be more effective than sort of trying to talk in generalities, which we do a lot as student accessibility services. Part of disability services is we have to talk in generalities because everything really is sort of individualized, and it's important that we engage in that sort of interactive process. So sometimes hard to give you the exact answer that you might be looking for.
Thanks, Aaron. There's a good question here about how a student might best prepare for their 30-minute advisory meeting. I would say students come to that meeting with all different types of preparation. I wouldn't worry too much about it. I would say the main thing to focus on is just kind of think about, if a student has a history of accommodations, what might have worked for them or didn't work, and just kind of how they might have felt their disability manifested itself in kind of previous academic contexts, and anything that they're thinking about as it relates to how that might show up for them while they're at UVM. And then also, and this obviously depends on the nature of a student's disability. It's good for them to kind of have a sense of what, if any, providers that they are working with, whether they're working with primary care physician, a therapist, a psychiatrist, whomever it may be, based on the disability. That's something that's also helpful for us to know, because it's generally good practice for a student in terms of establishing their eligibility with our office, but also just for their own well-being, of course, to be connected with a provider. And depending on the nature of the disability, there are often on-campus providers and resources that we might want to talk to a student about kind of getting set up with. So I would say that history kind of accommodations, and then just kind of their work with providers around any or all of their disabilities. Those would be helpful things to know in advance. But it's not something where a student should feel super pressured to show up. We want them to be able to feel safe and be able to be open kind of about their disability and their kind of history with accommodations, and what they're thinking about in terms of how that's going to show up for them at UVM. Another question here in the chat about kind of any kind of pass or doctor's note needed to access the elevators. By and large, no. We've really worked with residential life. In terms of accessibility, elevators should be no less accessible to students than the stairs. And so usually whatever kind of, if there's a key or cat card needed to get to specific stairs, that would be what would be needed for an elevator. And that's, generally if a student lives there, they would have access to that. In a specific circumstance, there are some elevators that have kind of usage limits depending on what the building is. And there's so many different buildings kind of on campus. If there was ever an issue around accessibility, that's something that we collaborate with university housing on, and university housing should be able to address that directly for any student. Certainly if a student has any problems around an elevator accessibility in their residence hall, they can be in touch with us and we can work with them in university housing to get that addressed as soon as possible. But that should be pretty straightforward. And same thing in an academic buildings or kind of the data center, which is the student center on campus. There are elevators in those locations and they're available for everyone to use. Most every building on campus has elevators. There are a handful of older buildings that might not, and if that poses a mobility concern for a student, and again, this doesn't come up too often because it's just a handful of buildings, we can actually work with the registrar to have a classroom moved to an accessible location, and we've done that in the past. There's a question here as well about note-taking. I know I might have been in process of kind of answering the other note-taking question that happened, but just to kind of recap that, it's our second most common type of accommodation, and there's a peer assigned in a specific course. We work with the faculty member. We provide some incentives for students that are willing to be note takers, and it's a confidential process, but they upload notes to an online portal that are then accessible to a student to view in real time throughout the semester. They get an email notification every time notes are uploaded. The one thing I will emphasize about that, and I didn't mention this before, is students should check their notes regularly. We often will put multiple volunteers in a course if they're available, but if there's a concern around the quality or the timeliness of when the notes are uploaded, we ask note takers to upload them within 48 hours of the class. Students should give us that feedback. And what every once in a while will happen is a student might have a concern around notes, but they don't check them until the night before an exam or something like that, after they've been uploaded for 4 weeks, and then it becomes difficult for us to address it. We, by and large, we have a really good culture of note taking here, and students like being note takers, and faculty are great partners in that process of getting note takers set up. But cannot emphasize enough the importance of regularly checking in on those notes beyond it helping students avoid kind of a last minute surprise the night before an exam. It's just a good study habit to check those notes regularly and kind of keep pace with the course content as opposed to trying to cram all that information the night before. That goes for all students, regardless of whether or not they're working with SAS.
Yeah, and
Uh,
I'll just add to that, Nate. There are a couple other note-taking assistance accommodations. So one is the use of a laptop in class. So a lot of professors, they have sort of an open policy about students using laptops to take notes or iPads, whatever the case may be. Some are a little bit more restrictive, a little more old school, and in those cases, sometimes students will need an accommodation to utilize their laptop in class. And then some students benefit from an audio recorder, being able to record a lecture so they can listen back in case they missed information, things like that. So do have a sort of a variety of note taking accommodations that students potentially can have access to.
Great point,
I,
Aaron.
I'm happy to jump on the next one too, Nate, about the
Yeah,
extended time
go
going
for
in.
it.
So one of the really cool things that UVM provides, so a lot of students have extended time on tests and quizzes, and that concern about, you've got your first class of the day with extended time, but you've got a class right after it. So what exam accommodations can work in a couple of different ways. Professors can provide those accommodations in the classroom, so they can provide you extended time in the classroom or provide an alternative location for you to test if you have a reduced distraction environment. If their exams are online, they can actually build the extended time into Brightspace, which is the learning management system the university uses. And so, you get your extended time, you take the test wherever you want to. But often, and I think in most cases, students will use our exam proctoring center. And our exam proctoring center is set up to manage exam accommodations and specifically those extended time accommodations such that students don't have conflicts with other class. So one of the things the exam proctoring center can do is they can adjust the start time of an exam so that you start early and end at the same time as your class so that you can get to your next class. Or it might be something where you've got a class before, and so then the exam has to go later than your class. So we have ways around that so that students don't have a conflict with their classes, and we work really hard to make sure that that's the case because we want you to be able to access all of your classes, and we don't want to penalize you in one class because you have an accommodation in a different one. So.
Exactly right. And actually our portal won't even let students
Won't even
book
let you do it.
over a class. Yeah, right. That creates a conflict. And so that, we're open 60 hours a week, the proctoring center during the academic year, basically 8 to 9 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and then kind of standard 8 to 4:30 hours on Friday. And usually that allows the student to kind of have the ability to find a soft spot in their schedule to get that exam in, and never are they put into that situation where they have to kind of make a choice, go to class or use their accommodation, as Aaron said. Um, I think right now that looks like the extent of the questions we have in the Q&A. If folks have any more, they can toss them in there. But as Aaron and I mentioned, you can certainly reach out to us individually or to our general account about any questions you have. I put that getting started link in the chat as well. That's um, on our forms link as well, but that's the most important accommodation, or excuse me, form to kind of fill out if you haven't done that already, just because that's really kind of the gateway into our office. And I also mentioned in the chat that we plan on having this video posted by the end of the week. And again, kind of modeling accessibility. Our goal after this, we get the recording, will be kind of captioned because we want to make sure it's accessible to everyone before we post it for anyone. And so we'll get that captioned, which will just take a day or two. And then we'll work with orientation to get that posted, and we'll look to have that posted on our website as well. So it'll be on the new student insight session for orientation, but we'll make sure to have a link on our homepage to see a question that just came in about that. So this will be available throughout the summer for folks that, again, want to watch it again, or folks that didn't have the chance to view it live. And we're here all summer. Don't hesitate to ask us any questions along the way. And again, whether you're a student watching this or a family member, get started with our office if you haven't already. And again, it's something that is important for accommodations, but also just to kind of help you understand maybe some other support services that we might be able to link you up with. And that's a key part of any kind of introductory meeting with our office. So really appreciate everybody who came tonight, and great questions that I think benefited everyone. And we're all looking forward to seeing everybody come here in the fall. All right. Take care, everybody.